Thank you, Bryce. Thank you all for being here. It's my first time coming to this meeting. I hope not my last. I genuinely appreciate the opportunity to be here and visit with you. And I really want to extend my thanks for your outstanding Southern hospitality that you would lay on Canadian weather just to make me feel at home. That is above and beyond the call of duty. So thank you for that. For those of you just making your way in and at the back of the room, I am standing up. In Canada, I'm 6 feet tall, but when I come to the United States with the exchange rate, I'm only 5'7". All right, so my goal for this morning is to share a little bit of food for thought, a little bit of data. Usually I'm kind of a heavy science and data guy. Today will be a little bit different. There'll be some of that, but some food for thought for how you may make decisions on your dairies, how you may make some decisions around goals and practices for how long you keep dairies on your farms, and tee things up for my friend Steve Eicher, who will follow. So by way of background to this, this is the question we're going to try and ask here. So audience poll, I'm quite impressed here. You're all awake and bright-eyed and bushy-tailed at 8 o'clock in the morning after the hospitality. But so, is greater longevity inherently a good goal for dairy cows? Who says yes? Who says no? We've got a lot of Switzerland out there. Okay. You're going to give out awards later today, I believe, for herds that are being recognized for excellence in achieving high milk production, excellent quality of milk. Should there be an award for the herd with the oldest cows? Would that be a good idea? Some people might think so. Hang on to that thought. Okay, to set this up, in 2004, I had only a few years out of grad school, new faculty member, got a phone call from American Dairy Science Association saying, we're doing this Discover conference. We'd like you to come and give a talk. Wow, I was feeling pretty chuffed. It's in Nashville. Cool. Nightlife, country music. So I learned something, that there's more than one Nashville. This wasn't the one I had in mind. Nashville, Indiana was in the heart of the last dry county in Indiana. Anyway, and they asked me to give a talk. That's it. You can tell it's old because of the comic font there, but reproduction, its impact on cow survival and replacement for 45 minutes. Kind of puzzled on that for a minute. I mean, I work at a university. Normally I can talk for hours, but I kind of thought about the subject and I made one slide. That's it. That's the epidemiology, the economics, all rolled into one. But since I work at a university, I added another 40 slides after that. But so fast forward, and then I did actually go through some data and things. And at the time, so this is 20 years ago, at the end of my talk, that was my conclusion. The major reproductive disease of dairy cattle was semen deficiency. And the good news is that mostly we have cured that in the last 20 years. I mean, there are still a few cows that suffer, at least for a while, from semen deficiency, but we have gotten way better on a whole bunch of fronts at managing and curing and preventing semen deficiency. So now we've got some other hills to climb. So fast forward to last year, there's another ADSA Discover conference on longevity. They hadn't really learned very well, so they asked me to give another talk, this time about the association between health and longevity. So I puzzled on that for a while and made a slide. But there's a nuance. It depends, right? I mean, for any of you, I don't know, spent any time in a university, you know that a professor can always ask a question. It's like having a discussion with a 3-year-old, and the grad student can always answer, it depends. And then if you're a smart enough old professor, you say, on what? And this goes back and forth forever. But yeah, it depends. So that's a little bit what we're going to get into looking at this morning is what does it depend on how we make sense of this? I will preface this by saying I understand that I'm preaching to the choir, that the average dairyman is probably quite a bit smarter than the average epidemiologist or policymaker. But what I hope is for some, maybe to give you a few bits and pieces of food for thought for your own operation or your own clients. But for others, it may be in having discussions with your milk buyers, retailers, others who may have good intentions about how to measure cow health, welfare, longevity, but hopefully to equip you with some food for thought on how to engage in some of those arguments more fruitfully. Like, for instance, whether we ought to have an award for who has the oldest cows. Hint, probably not. So up on the top corner here, some of you may be familiar with Cow Signals. They're a consulting organization out of the Netherlands. They operate all over the world. They do lots of good work. But one of their big marketing taglines is what you see up there, 2 more lactations. That's the goal. If we do things right, we'll get 2 more lactations out of every cow. Is that a good goal? Should we? What's the average lifespan of a dairy cow in the US? How many lactations? 2.5-ish, something like that. So would 4.5 be better? Would life be better if every cow had 4.5 lactations instead of 2.5 lactations? I sense uncertainty. Okay, hang on. This one's from home, my home, Canada. We give out industry awards too. They're about to be announced in a couple of weeks. One of the 5 buckets on which dairies get scored for these awards is this, longevity. And I'm going to read some of this. Calculated the annual average percentage of cows that are in their 3rd or greater lactation. All right. It is a measure of good management in regards to cow comfort, herd health, productive life, and a problem-free herd. Is that true? It depends. Yeah. Increased longevity allows for higher production, decreased animal replacement costs, and excess animals to sell as replacements. I mean, that sounds desirable, doesn't it? Let's see. Y'all know who that is? Yeah. That's Guru Jones. So what are we trying to do? We're trying to, make money in the dairy business. We're trying to do right by our cows. We're trying to feed people. Breaking cows. So the cow that would otherwise stay in your herd should otherwise stay in your herd because she's a productive animal that gets broken because she has a big wreck at calving or a terrible case of mastitis or goes lame and we can't put her right. That's breaking cows, and that is clearly not good. I don't think anyone would argue in favor of that because of any or all of it's not good for cow welfare. It's not a good look for our industry. And even if you're just a hardcore business person, it's not good for business. But we do slip sometimes into these debates around quality versus quantity of life, and that can get into a whole ethical realm. But I would submit that probably what we owe to our cows is a good quality of life and ultimately a good quality of death, not inherently 2 more lactations or something like that. And you'll hear more today from Frank Mittlerner on the environmental side of things. But again, having cows optimize their healthy lifespan is what we're after. Not necessarily maximize, but optimize. So I spend my time doing research on health and fertility in dairy cows, and I doubt I'm ever going to run out of work. But if we really push on things, I think we can get down to a fairly short list of things that are really career-limiting moves, career-ending moves for dairy cows. Not getting pregnant is for sure one of them, right? Basic biology. Best cow in the world, if you can't get her back in calf, she becomes a beef cow. Low milk, what that means to different dairies is going to vary a lot. One person's best cow is another one's worse. But these two diseases in particular, mastitis and lameness, I'll come back to that, but those are the ones that are potentially really the deal breakers. So these are my premises. You're gonna see this slide twice this morning. Culling is an economic decision, and I think Steve will talk more about this, but when is it time for a cow to leave? When her net present value is less than her replacement. That's easy to say and quite hard to calculate, but that's the premise. Or you might choose to make a decision to kind of override that, as long as it's a conscious decision. But my point is that culling is an economic decision. It's not the reciprocal of welfare. Poor health will clearly reduce productive lifespan, right? I could have a cow who ought to stay in my herd because she has a great genetic and actual potential to make milk, but if she's got chronic mastitis or lameness, that trumps that. However, longevity is a poor measure of health and welfare, and I'll make the case for why that is. So no cow before her time, but we have to be really careful about how we measure that, and in particular, that we avoid the pitfall of saying that our ability to keep cows around for a long time means that their welfare is good and that we're good managers. Again, I would argue that ethics and social license and what our customers expect from us is that cows have a good quality of life, not that they live for 20 years. And last but not least, we talk about cows being metabolic athletes, that those are demanding lives, not distressed lives. Okay, audience participation. Who's got a 90-pound tank average? Hands up. Beautiful. Well done. I'll be honest, I deliberately set this up that I was hoping not many people would raise their hands, so thank you for playing. Okay. Furthermore, do you have a 90-pound tank average and less than 20% annual culling? Not a one. Isn't that what we're after? I thought that was good. Isn't that good? Who wants a 90-pound tank average? Is that good? Is it better than 80-pound tank average? Probably. Isn't 20% culling better than 30% culling? All together now. It depends. Okay. If you don't have those two things, is it because high production from pushing the cows is breaking the cows? We're exceeding the limits of biology. We're being money-grubbing, nasty people, breaking our cows by demanding too much from them. Is that the deal? Is that our problem? No, I hope not. Or if you have a higher culling rate than that, is it maybe because you've got a good supply of heifers knocking on the door that gives you selection pressure to remove animals from the herd? And again, I think Steve's going to talk more about this in the next session, but does anyone here, hands up, who are all the actual dairy producers here? Okay, thank you. And the rest of us are just barnacles on the, yeah, but do you have any below average cows in your herd? I know some of you don't, but your neighbors do. That your neighbors, they may have some below average cows. So does anybody here ever walk through the barn and say, there is not a cow in here I could part with? There is not a cow in here who's pulling down my herd average. There's not a cow in here who's raising my somatic cell count. There is always a below average cow. Why is she there? She's there till someone else pushes her out of the way, right? Okay. Old epidemiology. So this is the kind of thing we learn about in vet school and grad school. This one's from 1999, and it kind of lays out this map of associations of how diseases relate one to another, and ultimately how they may all contribute to culling. On one hand, this is kind of obvious. You know, most dairymen would recognize this, yeah, these things are connected. I mean, we could argue about, does this really cause that? And, is it an association? Is it a cause? Is it sometimes true, not always true? And all that's true. I think two sides of the coin. One, these are associations, not causes, not absolute truths. At the time, this was still relatively new. Through the late 70s into the 80s, into the 90s, understanding how diseases were interrelated was actually a big step forward. We take that for granted now, but like everything, at one time, that was kind of new as people figured this out and figured out how to quantify it and understand that these things didn't just happen in isolation. Real life tends to look more complicated. So we could have a simple situation, get sick, die. That's just unequivocally bad. But you could have get sick, make less milk, and because you make less milk, then you get culled. Or disease contributes to, or if not directly causes a cow not to get pregnant, and that's fatal. But reality looks more like the bottom here. And again, that's just intuitive. That's every day running a dairy. But if you're figuring out what criteria to give herd awards out on, or perhaps more importantly, what criteria milk buyers are going to measure whether you are meeting societal or consumer or retailer expectations, that you want healthy cows with good welfare and so on, what are we actually going to measure? And it is potentially a big pitfall to say, well, we need your cull rate to be less than 30% or 25% or whatever. Because are these things associated? Yeah, they are. But, sorry, well, we'll do that now. I'm actually, hang on. I want to jump ahead. This is to here. Health issues are confounded by milk, right? If a cow has metritis, you probably don't DNB her that day. You wait and see if she recovers and what her milk does. Even if a cow has a DA, you probably don't DNB her, make her a cull cow that day. You wait and see how she turns out. Is that a risk factor for bad stuff? Absolutely. Does every DA cow become a cull cow? No, right? It depends. And what does it depend on? Mostly whether her milk recovers and whether she gets back in calf again. And so this group epidemiologists from 25 years ago, this is super simplistic, but the point is just, and we can argue about whether these are important things, ketosis and cystic ovaries and mastitis and so on, but each of them by itself, if it's considered in isolation, was fairly strongly associated with increased risk of culling. But if they also accounted for milk yield, it started to change. The numbers change, which ones were associated change. If you add in reproduction, it changes again. And if you consider both milk and repro, it changes again. That would be extremely obvious to everyone who milks cows. But the caveat is it's not necessarily obvious to researchers who are coming along retrospectively looking at big sets of data, trying to understand what's associated with what, or industry associations trying to say, how can we have metrics that tell us whether dairies are doing a good job about our social or business expectations? Now, if I go backwards here, these are some old data from Jose Santos, but I think they tell a nice story. So this was from herds in California that were on precinct trials, but they kept really careful track of the cow's health through the transition period. And so looking at dystocia, metritis, endometritis, fever, mastitis, ketosis, lameness, etc. It won't surprise you that each and practically all of those were associated with dragging down pregnancy at first insemination, right? None of those are good things. The two things that I think are kind of really hold up over time from these data are up in the top row here. The sobering number is this one. If you keep careful track of dystocia, metritis, endometritis, ketosis, mastitis, etc., barely more than half, 56% of the cows make it through the transition period without experiencing at least one of those problems. That's kind of sobering. However, even in very large, very high production, intensively managed herds, in this case in California, before the days of double ovsync, healthy cows, over 50% pregnancy at first insemination. So we haven't bred the fertility out of the modern high-producing Holstein cow. Our challenge is just to keep her healthy and let her express her genetic potential and so on. But now, so I'm also a curious person, and I wanted to put this in some kind of context because, you know, the day the New York Times or whatever has the headline, "Half of cows sick," that doesn't sound very good. So I wanted some context. So since I'm from Canada, I put this in the context of hockey players. So half of professional hockey players miss at least one game a year due to injury. So I would say that our dairy cows are metabolic athletes, and they're kind of like the professional athletes. I don't know, does that make that good or not? But anyway, at home, that goes over really big. Sorry, I didn't find any NFL stats. Sorry. All right, college football stats. And sorry, coming back to, this is from that, you know, it depends on when you account for things. I'll just pull some of this off the bottom. The impact of health disorders on longevity is on average weak compared to the impact of low milk yield and poor reproductive performance, right? It depends. This is some data that I worked on with one of my postdocs. It was, what was good about it was we had really detailed data from a big common transition facility in Germany. About 2,000 calvings worth of data. We had really good data on disease, milk fevers, RPs, metritis, ketosis, twins, or mastitis. We didn't have milk data in here, so that's the big downside. The interesting thing, though, this is looking at time or risk of culling. So we've got, you know, everybody calves here at time 0, and they go out for 120 days. First lactation animals on the left, older cows on the right. And you can see that what shows up here is that first calvers that did or didn't have one of these diseases, there was very little effect on their risk of culling, at least to 120 days. And we did it to 250, and it wasn't much different. Whereas older cows, big difference. Even a single disease, big difference in their culling risk. And if you split that out between a single disease or multiple diseases, so 0, 1, or more than one disease, again, big difference for the older cows, less so for the younger cows. The interesting thing here is this biology or psychology or economics, right? So are primiparous, you know, first calvers actually more resilient, or are we just going to hang on to them because we probably rightly think they've still got a lot more value in them? And interesting that this was kind of the academic exercise, took the same data set and used some fancier, newer statistics with machine learning. Essentially, that's a little bit of a black box, but it's saying rather than humans laying out the order of things in the statistical analysis, you kind of let the black box find its way through the data. The point here that's interesting is that left to that, looking for what was most influential, it went down through, we got milk fever, DA, mastitis, ketosis, and only then did lactation number come in as less influential on culling risk than all those other things. Okay, here's some data from a big study we did 15 years ago now. 2,000 cows from herds, mostly in Western New York, a couple thousand cow dairies apiece, and a couple of several hundred cow dairies in in Ontario, close to where I work. We had excellent data on most things. The only thing that was sort of the big missing piece here was we weren't proactively scoring lameness, but we had data on tough calving twins, RP, metritis, DAs, mastitis, ketosis, uterine disease, et cetera, et cetera. It won't surprise you that in terms of early culling, so this is culled by 63 days, dystocia twins, RP, not metritis, DA, not mastitis, ketosis, all of those were associated with culling risk, okay? Same data set, but now it's culling by 300 days instead of by 63 days. So more cows are culled, the bars are all taller. But things shift. Things that are more distant in the rear view mirror, were no longer associated. So tough calving twins, RP metritis, were not associated with full lactation culling, but DA, mastitis, still ketosis, very much were. But that's still not the whole story. So we take it one step further. Now let's account for milk. So for early culling by 63 days, again, no surprise, cows that made more milk, way less likely to get culled. Cows with higher cell counts, more likely to get culled. When you control for all of that, DAs and ketosis were still associated with early culling risk. And finally, taking it out to 300 days, full lactation culling, again, no surprise, make more milk, very protective. Get pregnant, very protective. Don't get pregnant, going to leave the herd. DA and mastitis still end up in the mix after you account for those things. But the point is to look at all of them, not just to say, this or that disease is a cow's fate. One more. This one's from Germany. Massive data set here, 28,000 lactations from half that many cows on 2 big farms in Eastern Germany and Slovakia over many years. The headline, that they looked at a whole pile of stuff, but the headline was, no disease was associated with culling. That's a bit surprising. But they had detailed data on a number of days spent in the close-up pen, and that was associated with culling risk. And that, in turn, is associated with all this other bad stuff. So my point is just, it depends what you look at to what conclusion you're going to make, right? So if the headline is just, hey, disease isn't associated with culling, well, that's kind of missing the story a little bit. It's not wrong, but it's not the whole story. Okay. Even with the outstanding fertility programs we have now that have helped cure semen deficiency, health still matters. And we'll get into how and why that is in a second. But again, this is back to Germany. 7 years of data from one big herd, 15,000 cows, all on double ov sync for first service. And the point here is that cows that lived through retained placenta, metritis, mastitis, ketosis, DAs as a fresh cow, that knocked 10 to 15 percentage points off their success at first insemination. So having cows be healthy, just like from the California data, even if they're on a timed AI program, matters a lot. And it keeps mattering. This is, did they get pregnant? On the right-hand side is, did they stay pregnant? And again, cows that had lived through retained placenta, metritis, even if they got pregnant, were more likely to subsequently lose that pregnancy. So how is that? That cow that had a problem as a fresh cow has 2 or even 3 months to recover from it. There's not a cow in the world that's got a stinky metritis discharge when you go to breed her. There's not a cow that's going to be ketotic when you go to breed her. If she had mastitis as a fresh cow, that's long over. She either got better or she didn't, but she probably doesn't have it anymore, and so on and so on. So how is it that what a cow lives through as a fresh cow can affect her fertility for months and months after? Because it does. Well, basic biology, the egg that a cow ovulates today, whether spontaneously or at the end of her double ov sync or whatever, that egg, number one, has been carried around in her body from birth. Females, cattle, women, other female mammals, have all the eggs, all the oocytes they're going to have in their whole life at birth. They're microscopic, they're dormant. When they hit puberty, some of them start to get activated. The egg that a cow ovulates today probably started growing at least 2 months ago, and maybe as much as 4. We can only watch it with an ultrasound for the space of about a week or 10 days. Everything else before that is microscopic, but it's happening. And so quite a few years ago, Jack Britt, who was a professor at NC State, came up with this Britt hypothesis, which was working off of this knowledge that eggs, oocytes, take many, many weeks, months to develop. And so the environment that they are in as they begin to grow probably has an effect on their quality and the likelihood that that oocyte will result in an embryo when the cow is bred, that she'll get pregnant and stay pregnant. And so his observation was that as cows go through calving and they go through negative energy balance, that probably, plausibly, would have an effect, directly or indirectly, on eggs. Again, it's a hypothesis. The mechanisms for that are not really clear, but it has stood the test of time, and it makes sense because what we see is that there's these long tails of what a cow experiences, a fresh cow, out for her fertility for many months afterwards. You'll hear this afternoon from Aaron Horst about some new science and thoughts about inflammation in fresh cows. This is firmly tongue-in-cheek here. I do not I'm not holding myself up to be anything like Dr. Britt, so please, I'm not taking myself seriously. But the other part that we're adding into here now is inflammation. So there's the negative energy balance piece of it, but as cows go through inflammation, more or less as a fresh cow, that too probably has or plausibly has some impacts that last for months on a cow's fertility. So a little bit of new data from, or newish data from my research team. This fellow up here is Tony Brinje, he's a vet from Brazil. He's just started on faculty at South Dakota State after doing a PhD with me. In this study, we took 2 herds milking just under 500 cows apiece, super intensive monitoring twice a week, blood samples, lameness samples, metritis, ketosis, you name it. We tried to measure it. And the goal here was to understand what was associated with cows showing a fertile estrus in herds using activity monitors as one of their main tools. We measured things that took blood samples like calcium and haptoglobin and ketosis and so forth. Also clinical things like metritis and lameness and mastitis and so on. I'll just draw your attention down here. 29% of these cows, and these were in high producing, these would be 9,500 pound a day herds with 25, 26% preg rates, okay? Outstanding, really well managed herds. And when you kept careful track, just like in California, collectively, we've got 47% of the cows experienced at least one clinical disease problem as a fresh cow. That's not even counting the ones you got to go look for with a blood test. The headline, 70% of the cows were found in heat by 75 days in milk by activity monitors. That was the premise of the study. These were herds that were relying on activity monitors. That was their management choice. A bunch of things that you might guess: retained placenta, excessive inflammation measured by blood haptoglobin, ketosis, endometritis, pus discharge in the repro tract, delayed onset of cyclicity, losing more than half a point of body score, separated out around that mean. So cows that didn't have those problems were up in the 75 to 80% likelihood of having an activity detected heat. Whereas cows that did have those issues were getting pulled down closer to 65 or even 60% of the cows. Again, some of those things would require researchy level monitoring, but if we distilled it down to stuff that is tangible on farm, retained placenta, pus discharge in the repro tract at a month postpartum, lameness and losing more than half a point of body score. Cows that didn't have any of those issues, 82% of them were detected in heat by activity, no intervention. Cows with one of those issues drops down to 69%. Cows with 2 or more of those issues drops down to just barely more than half of them had a heat. Heat is good, but pregnancy is better. And so pregnancy at first AI, out of this big hopper, this big wide funnel of a bunch of risk factors, 2 wound up coming out the bottom as associated with pregnancy at first service. 1 was elevated excessively elevated haptoglobin, a marker of inflammation, perhaps too much inflammation in the first week after calving. And the other is kind of a filter or a catch-all for reproductive health, and that's pus, purulent vaginal discharge at a month postpartum. And my point here is that that goes back to some of what I've been talking about, that a cow can have a bad start, but if she recovers from it, she's likely to go on to success. Whereas if we've got lingering problems, in this particular example, lingering reproductive tract infection and inflammation, that's where things are really going to have an effect on fertility going forward. And in that, this is from the same study, specific to uterine disease, so RPs, metritis, pus, and endometritis based on cytology, so chronic smoldering, low-grade inflammation in the uterus. We used a gene-based test for really early pregnancy diagnosis, then blood tests for PAGs from day 29, 33, and 40. And what you can see is two things. Healthy cows are actually pretty good at getting pregnant. All cows lose pregnancies at an unfortunate clip. But cows that lived through uterine disease 2 to 3 months in the past have about a double increase in their likelihood of losing their pregnancy. So they made it through the first bar, they got pregnant at first service, and then lose it afterwards. Again, these lingering effects months after the events in question. So, fixable problems, metritis, early lameness, some first cases of mastitis, to some extent, this chronic smoldering infection in the reproductive tract. But we've got a bunch of other problems that we're not very good at fixing right now, and those become the career-limiting issues. So you saw this before. Culling's an economic decision, right? It's not a measure of welfare per se, or at least not necessarily so. Poor health will reduce productive lifespan, but percent of the herd that's old is a poor measure of welfare or health. There's much as it would be obvious to any dairyman managing their herd and making culling decisions, you're going to look at health and milk quality and your supply of heifers. That's just intuitive and obvious. The kicker is it's harder than it sounds to aggregate those data, to put things together to do research, but more to the point of doing the research is to inform targets, policies, things that are going to have impacts on your business, because your milk buyers or retailers or others may be saying, well, we think this is an appropriate way to measure whether you're doing a good job of keeping your cows alive or keeping your cows healthy or having your cows have good welfare. So that's why it matters beyond, doing academic things. And it's a bit harder than it sounds. Having those data sets that actually allow us to formally analyze, accounting for all the stuff that you do in your head or on your own farm computer, we're actually still limited there. We're not as far ahead as that as we'd like to be. And again, this is obvious to you, but it doesn't always get factored in. Milk price, heifer supply, beef price, etc., matter a lot to that. And that is almost never in these studies that start, well, what's the association of disease with culling? What's the association of disease with culling accounting for milk? What's the association of disease with culling accounting for milk and fertility and milk price and heifer supply and beef price and so on? That's harder than it sounds to do. Again, prevention is the main goal. And the two things that are probably really worthy of our greatest attention are lameness and mastitis, because their impact, their importance, is the product of the proportion of cows affected, which still tends to be fairly high, and the impact per case, which also tends to be high. So what's ahead? Geneticists are working on what's called a resilience phenotype. So that's the ability of cows to go through some bad stuff, but recover. If I circle back to the beginning, how long should a cow stay in the herd? Well, that's an economic question, and it's a complicated one. Most of the models that have tried to work out the economics of when should I replace a cow are complicated. And most of them don't account for the risk of bad stuff happening at calving, which is important because that is a risk. But the thing that I would argue is that that should not deter us from wanting to have cows calve about every 12 to 13 months, because that is the economic imperative. We should not be put off of that by saying, you know what, we can't manage calving, therefore it should be our goal to have cows calve fewer times in their life so they don't have to run through that minefield one extra time. Instead, we should say we can do better with that, and let's keep our eye on the ball of no cow before her time, but also not hanging on to cows longer than what should be their time. So I'm going to wrap it up there. Thank you for your attention. I appreciate your interest, and I'm happy to take a couple of questions before I hand over to Steve. Questions?
Okay, well, it looks like that's all the time we have. So I would encourage you, if you would like to talk to Stephen more, grab him aside. I'm sure he'd be happy to answer any questions.
You bet.
Our next speaker